Glenn, that was terrific. I have questions for these guys, but they've raised so many questions that I am going to let you all ask the questions first. So,
hi, Steve Ash here. This is really weird, this microphone. Okay. So I was most interested in what you called the phase 4, I think, of the model that you mentioned. How do you ensure equitable access? For sure, capitalism is great at distributing things according to ability to pay. But we also use rights to distribute benefits. And as you pointed out, people contribute their data to the development of these algorithms. What do you think a good legal regime would be to counteract distribution on the ability to pay and move it more towards a rights-based regime?
Great question. So one of my favorite trivia questions for my students is, can you name the one place in America where you have a constitutional right to health care? And the answer is actually prison. It's the only place we've held that actually, because the state removes you from society and puts you in there, they have duties of care that are minimal. So we live in a society where health care is not regarded as a legal right in terms of a positive entitlement, but more of a do not right, a right of non-interference and the like. I think biospecimens is a really interesting kind of example to kind of think about this in. So my friend Rebecca Skloot has this great book on Henrietta Lacks, which caused a lot of people to suddenly realize that all the blood you've been having drawn for every test, the past life, every tumor, every kidney, everything you've ever had removed, guess what happened to it? Somewhere along the way, you probably signed a form signing away your rights. Would it be better to have a regime where people refuse to share their data, or people essentially kind of claim property rights in each of their data the way they do their body? I think probably not, for a number of reasons. First, we'd have what's called lockout problems. People tend to overestimate the benefit of their data or their biospecimens as compared to everybody else's in the aggregate. Henrietta Lacks is the case, the exception that proves the rules, which was really valuable. But the other thing to think about, I think the best model to think about this is actually to think about data like taxes. So the same way you have an obligation in a political society to pay taxes, but there's also an expectation that those taxes are spent for the public good, and there are violations of things they can't do with your taxes. Perhaps we ought to think about data as a kind of tax, or healthcare data as a kind of tax that we're imposing upon you, but on terms the political society understands as requiring some kind of sharing and some kind of equitable sort of thing. But again, you know, I'm a lawyer, so I'm very cynical. So that would be my ideal world, but I'm not sure that'll be the world of the actual property right allocation.
I think that's a very thoughtful comment. I would just add one perspective. Sadly, healthcare in prison is not a pretty picture, and that ought to be an important cautionary note for any strategy that focuses too much on rights. So, I want to be as far away as possible from sounding cynical about rights, given what I do for a living. But it's important to recognize two different ways in which rights operate in our system, right? One way rights operate is as a shorthand way of having a conversation about what's the right thing to do in society. Separately, they operate legally to make institutions do certain things. In that whole second bucket of things, it's important to recognize the interaction between the articulation of a right in a court case, for example, and the way legislatures and social movements respond to that idea. And ultimately, it's just important to recognize that if you don't build enough consensus in the legislature, in the social sector, or among social movements, it becomes incredibly challenging sometimes to close the gap between a right that might be articulated in a constitution or in a court case and the reality. And I just highlight not only corrections, but also education as an example of how that challenge plays out.
I'm going to interject my own question here because Tino just raised the issue of consensus building in law. And things are happening so fast here. How will the law stay caught up? And what will happen in terms of consensus? This came up at lunch at our table today, where if we rely so much on the data, where will there be room for nuance and the consensus building that has to happen in the creation of new law?
So I'd start with an expression of very general, at 50,000 feet, faith in a legal system like ours that has a degree of adaptability and flexibility built into it through what we call the common law, tort cases and litigation, but also through legislative deliberation. But now comes like the real world, catching up to that vision. And that includes legislatures that have difficulty enacting legislation, organized interests competing for power and influence, people getting frustrated with how slow regulatory agencies are to change. And probably the picture that emerges for me is one that has blemishes, but has potential to it. And I would note that, the better we are as a society at deliberating carefully about where we are going to allow experimentation, and deliberately so, the better we're going to do. And to me, that includes not only at the level of like society passing laws to say, here's something we're going to experiment with, but at the micro level of organizations, saying like, what is it this organization, using its lawyers and its money, et cetera, is going to designate as a place where we are going to deliberately like take some risks. And that is tricky and risky inherently, but it highlights Professor Cohen's point about how the distinction between service delivery and research is getting blurred, and we have to think about very specifically what we want that to look like inside organizations.
Well, and it also relates to what John was talking about in terms of being more selective.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to be selective because there's a natural tendency both for scientists and whoever is involved with data to just generate more and more and do more and more with that. But I think that some planning and some advanced thinking about why are we doing this and what exactly do we want to get, I think it would be really helpful. And that would probably give a little bit more time for the laws and the regulations to catch up with that flurry of generating new information. I think separating what is research and what is care, or at least finding some boundaries, is a very common challenge. And there are already examples where we have managed to do that. So I don't think that they're impossible to overcome. But we need more transparency and more clarity. Is that a data set that is being compiled for research purposes? Is it for health and has lots of privacy connotations, or is it completely open? So this needs to be defined in advance. And I think then the rules are set more clearly for everyone on what is being done.
And I'll just add, so we're in California, so I'm pretty safe in saying this. There's been probably one bright spot in the Trump administration picks to run the agencies, and that's actually Scott Gottlieb at FDA. If you talk to people across the political spectrum, I think people are very happy with the job he's done. He's been very farsighted on these issues. But there's a structural problem, which is Stanford, West Coast code, happens with updates every 2 weeks to your app, right? FDA does not move on that schedule. FDA is not used to that kind of approach to a product. So if you think that these products are going to fall within FDA's jurisdiction, there's going to be a problem of cultural fit and a question of nimbleness. So I think one has to think it's a very hard problem, which I had a great answer to it. But if you think this is mostly like a pacemaker or a device, it's going to turn out that the existing regulatory framework for that may not be ideal for this kind of work.
Well, and I would raise the question of who, so you say, okay, FDA can be making some of these selections. Who else is going to make the selections?
I mean, payers are probably going to be there, the hidden forces in all of this. Because if you have a great product that does great value and does great things for the world, but nobody's willing to pay for it, chances are you're not going to get your product to the end of development. So in other areas of healthcare in the United States, payers have a really interesting role to play, but one that is not very transparent and one that's also not very justiciable when they deny you something. There are ways of suing a payer, but if a payer decides not to fund something for whatever reason, it tends to happen that it doesn't come into existence.
Wherever the mics are, I know there are questions throughout.
I got one here.
Okay,
Can I? Hi, I'm over here.
great.
Thank you for this panel. This is my mind is blown. It's like a massive, massive conversation. Can you help me parse out a few different tensions? One is like the internationalization of regulations. So you've mentioned GDPR, and when GDPR passed, I was like, yay EU, but then suddenly I got all of these updates on how it applied to me. And so the sort of that trend, and I don't know how like real that is. And then, the other end of the spectrum is of course this notion that while regulation is supposed to reflect sort of ethical standards and moralities of society, morality is hyper-local and really is going to come down to an individual in this case patients, in conversation with their family and perhaps with their doctor. That's just like an inherent tension I can't quite parse out in my head. And I think woven into this is that perhaps AI helps alleviate some of this tension, right? And we have a process in place where human intelligence can help work out this like system, but these humans have to go through medical school. They have to be like certified, maybe board certified. Are there frameworks in place for AI to also become board certified, for example, to like help actually drive real conversations and decisions at the local level?
I mean, you see the AI get haggard over the time of residency, lose some weight, and stuff like that.
Yeah, probably failed its test its freshman year. Yeah.
That's how you know it cares, though.
Exactly. Let me just start by saying, so a couple things. First of all, on GDPR and internationalization. So, who knew that I was on the listserv for cats who like to paint, right? The best thing about GDPR was to like reveal to you that you were on 7 million listservs you didn't even know you'd ever signed up for. But we really do have like a natural experiment about to happen now in that the EU is going in a very different direction when it comes to data privacy than we are in the United States. There'll be products that, as a result, will probably have kill switches. They won't work when they're geolocated in the EU. That's one way around them. But we'll see 5 or 10 years from now who made the better bet or who made the right bet. But it is a real trade-off. For people who think you can have everything, I think they are wrong in that the product development here requires sacrificing some amount of privacy and some amount of anonymity in a way that'll be harder to do in the EU than here. So that's what I was going to say on GDPR.
Can I add, what an interesting question. There's so many directions in which we can go. I'll just pick 2 of them. First, I would note, I kind of accept your premise generally that there's an aspect of morality that is deeply local, but I think there's a countervailing piece to that as well. So the sociologist might say what could have been extremely hyper-local 60, 70 years ago has been shaped by TV and then eventually the internet. And so in terms of just sheer day-to-day behavior and perceptions of what matters, it's getting less localized. And it could be that one way to understand the process we are having right now, where California just passed its own privacy law and it compares in some ways, overlaps with GDPR, in other ways does not. It's the process of going a little bit jurisdiction by jurisdiction, bottom up, to create a conversation where there's convergence. I'm somewhat hopeful about that, but I think it's not always going to be a pretty process. It'll be messy. Here's what I think is the more difficult and profound question that is raised by the very end of your comments. Somewhere around this campus right now, there is a conversation, probably a midnight bull session, playing out right now about when a machine can be appropriately viewed as being conscious or self-aware. Those conversations are going to continue to play out for a long time, and it may not be very soon before, or maybe very, very far in the future before those conversations start to feel more like they have a practical implication. But I want to highlight a scenario that is not yet where a philosophically oriented analysis yields the conclusion that this machine, this AI, is conscious, but instead where there's sort of a market test reflecting the way consumers or professionals react day to day. Whatever they tell you they are thinking is one thing, but the way they actually react day in, day out to the technology is something different. And they begin to react as though they're interacting with something that has a persona, an identity. I think that is a very powerful thing. That possibility to me is a lot more concrete, and it has much more to do with very technical, practical questions that are going to affect medical care, but other fields too, where the question really is, where does social norming converge with slight increases in technology when it comes to our ability to represent language effectively? And as social norms change and come to expect less and less sophistication from language, CF Twitter bots, and as technology improves, I can imagine some moment way, way before any sort of deep philosophical conclusion that something is conscious, where the lines begin to cross. And at that point, the possibilities that our legal system and our values will react in ways that get far ahead of where we think we are very real, and they have implications in both directions for healthcare. On the one hand, it means that maybe you can sort of cheapen the notion of care in problematic ways, but it also means potentially you can design technology that will make people feel like they've been listened to in a way that feels very remote right now.
Well, did you all see the article that was Sherry Turkle writing about the conversation of a human, and especially a child, with Alexa, and expecting that the response sounds empathetic, but there is no human empathy behind the response. We're already on that path. Where's the mic?
Over here. My question is, what are your thoughts on how regulation should or should not be used for the ethical question around, utilizing data sets to stratify risk of patients? So it could be financial risk to an ACO. It could be, risk of doing a surgery at an acute surgery center. And it may not come from the medical record, right? It may come from a consumer data set that can be purchased. How do you guys think that ethical question should be addressed? And it might not just be hard things, it might be soft things, like people who are higher risk get worse care.
So we've got some protected categories where you cannot engage in that stratification at the moment. We've made social judgments. We were actually talking about this around the lunch table. It was a good morning because everybody was talking at lunch. But I think to me it's a very fundamental question about cross-subsidization and the solidaristic nature of risk versus actuarial fairness, as it's sometimes put. In that, when we think about pricing for life insurance, the premium you pay for life insurance does not that well reflect your actual risk rate in terms of life insurance. We could alter it in such a way to take account of all these factors that would actually make it a better, more predictive and priced closer to what the prediction would be. The result would be, though, that there would be winners and losers, and the risk would not be spread widely, but instead would be stratified based on actual risk. That's assuming you have a model that's pretty good, right? Throw out all the cases where the model is bad, what makes things worse. Even if you have a model that's really good and then can stratify appropriately, I think it's a question about how much solidarism do we want in our society or not. And for me, the answer to those questions are heavily particularistic. So I think of life insurance very differently than I think of health insurance, for example. We have engaged in a commitment towards more socialization of risk when it comes to health. We have not engaged in the same activity for life. And I think even within those buckets, you could break it down in a way to think about it. But it's a question to me of political philosophy to kind of think about what you want, and also for the voters, what kind of society they want to live in.
Can I just highlight one quick thing? One great thing about your question is it highlights how under-theorized the notion of cost-benefit analysis can be. A convenient shorthand for how to answer that question might begin with, well, we do some kind of cost-benefit analysis. But all the points that Professor Cohen was bringing up earlier in his presentation about, well, what's the unit of analysis? How are you using this or that particular technique to weigh costs and benefits, to me, is part of what makes maybe the answer for health insurance and for life insurance very different.
John, you wanted
I
to
just
add?
wanted to add to that we need to decide what is the bar of evidence that we want in these cases. For example, the highest bar would be to ask for randomized trials specifically for using the model to improve outcomes. And then you have to define what are the outcomes that you want to improve. If you look across the entire biomedical literature, even though there's about 1 million randomized trials or clinical trials, there's about 200 that focus on testing predictive or diagnostic tests. And there's a very, very small number. Of those, less than 20% have found favorable results for the clinical outcome, even though they have promising results on performance, discrimination, predictive ability. At the end of the day, does it really improve clinical outcomes? Less than 20%. Can we ask for this type of evidence for everything that will come our way? Probably not. I think we need to ask for this type of evidence for some pivotal kind of test that will inform us about our whereabouts. Where are we roughly in our predictive ability? And then try to use other types of indirect evidence to make decisions which would have to be softer and less certain and carry a lot of uncertainty parentheses around them in their implementation.
Can I just follow up on that? Because I think you just said something very profound. What I hear you saying is, if we don't have extremely reliable academic high-quality information, it doesn't mean we can't use some kind of evidence to make decisions. We should just be candid and humble about how good that is.
Exactly. And I think this would apply to the vast majority of information that we'll be using or misusing.
Victor, you need a mic. Oh, good. Okay.
I want to come back then to the question of regulation, particularly of FDA. So when you think about health products, FDA traditionally regulates by efficacy and safety, right? So when it comes to these machine learning, AI products, you mentioned, of course, the FDA may not be well suited for this, yet I worry that actually we may do harm. I mean, there are lots of evidence that AI can do harm, and not just that it was not predictive or whatever. So that will require a high level of, a high bar for regulation. And I know FDA is trying in different ways, but I can't think of any other way to do this. You know, when you think about health being so different from a capital market, well, okay, nobody wants that product, so we don't use it. This, in fact, has potential of doing harm, and therefore first do no harm. If you can talk a word about this.
So that's very well said. We're almost out of time, so I'll say something very brief about it, which is to say, I'm with you, but I'm not sure America is, in that the move is to defang FDA and to focus on safety, not its efficacy role. So safety, they're with you, right? But I think, in fact, actually the questions of efficacy and whether we're going to live in a society where there's an efficacy gatekeeper or not is very much up for grabs in this particular political moment. I also think that one challenge for these products is the way in which, especially in the hospital systems, they have to be integrated into clinical workflow, such that even if a product shows in the randomized clinical trial very good evidence, in fact, in the real world, it may turn out that it actually causes more harm than good, in which case, even the vaunted FDA system of classification and pre-approval may not be good enough if you're really worried about patient safety.
Let me add to that I think that the amount of evidence needed to prove safety usually is more compared to the amount of evidence needed to prove efficacy. So I mean, it may be a sound decision. I'm not going to debate about that. But there's an expectation that, well, somehow we can move faster because we will need less evidence. And actually, we would need more evidence to document safety. And especially with some of these technologies, the rates of some serious harms may be low enough when you see them as percentage, but really grave when it comes to absolute terms about individuals being harmed. So it's a difficult crossroads in that regard.
Tino, do you want to have the last word?
I think we need to be careful. Look, I mean, I'll just briefly end with two comments. One, just underscoring how humble I feel with this panel, which is, I've learned a lot.
Says the justice. Go ahead.
But I think it is important to recognize this is not news to anybody, but our current system is enormously imperfect, and it's hard for me to ignore every day that I go to work. I live in an amazingly rich country and in an incredibly privileged part of a very rich country, and very large numbers of people have terrible or no access to healthcare. So it seems to me that you've heard a lot of caution from me and from probably all of us about evidence and about the technology and about the ethical issues, but there ought to be sort of an urgency about how we use innovation, because I don't think we're anywhere near where we need to be.
And that is the last word for this panel and this session, and now it's break time.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.